So Trina O'Connor, tell us about the book that you've chosen and why you chose to pick this one.
Yeah, Clodagh, thanks ever so much, because when you asked me to do this podcast, I had to revisit this book because I read it a while ago now. And it's a book by Justin Brooks, who is one of the co-founders of the Californian Innocence Project. And the book is called You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent, which I know to some people might sound like a bit of a dramatic title, but actually, when you read the book, you realise how apt it is, and that it's not dramatic at all, because it's based on the American criminal justice system, and it's based on real cases of people that the Innocence Projects in America have helped get them off death row and get them released from prison. And you've probably seen some of these videos on YouTube or wherever you look on socials of people who have been released from prison. And you see them eating a hamburger for the first time, or you see them embracing their family. And there's a very, very famous one, Brian Banks. You've probably heard of him. And I think the movie is still on Netflix at the moment. But this tells the story of a 17-year-old who was wrongfully convicted of rape. And he was a high-performing athlete. I'm almost sure it was American football. He was about 17. And Justin worked with him, and there is a chapter in the book about him, and it talks about how he was accused by eyewitness testimony by a girl. Well, actually, it wasn't even eyewitness testimony. It was just testimony. It was kind of on her words, and it was a false testimony. And if I remember correctly, in later years, she friended him, I think, on Facebook. And I think during conversations that they had while he was still in prison, because I think he went to prison for like a crazy amount of time, 30 odd years or something. And she admitted to him that she had made it all up. And he had lost his career and all that kind of stuff. But the movie, I don't want to spoil the movie. If you watch the movie, it will tell you the whole story. So Justin Brooks is somebody who I very much admire. And when I started out on my journey to become a criminologist, which is a long time ago now, obviously, like you, Clodagh, I was eating everything up when it came to crime and different criminal justice systems and different cases from around the world and all that kind of stuff. And I happened upon the Innocence Project in America through a girl that was in I have a couple of master's degrees, in my first master's degree. And she knew a lot about it. And basically, Justin Brooks is a man who was a lawyer, so a solicitor. And he was kind of lured into academia, I think, to work as a lecturer. But I don't think he lasted very long there, because what happened was he heard about a case of a lady called Marilyn. And Marilyn was a lady, and this is another chapter in the book. So I won't give all the details of the chapters, but just to give you an idea of who Justin is. So Justin heard of this case, and it was a woman who had been given a death sentence on a plea bargain. Now, for anyone who knows criminal justice, a plea bargain is supposed to be you plea to get a lesser sentence. And she plea bargained out, which meant that she didn't have a trial. So Justin, and he speaks about this, and the book speaks about this, it kind of piqued his interest, because it was like, how can you plea bargain and end up with a death sentence? Because the plea is supposed to give you a lesser sentence, and there's no worse sentence than a death sentence. And Marilyn was a black lady. I'm not sure where she was from in the States. It could have been California. I think it was actually California, because California has one of the highest kind of privately owned prisons in America, and a lot of them are profit driven as well, and that kind of leads into some of the reasons why we see some of these cases in America. So Marilyn, Justin started working. He went to visit her, and when he spoke to her, it turned out she was up for murder, I think. It turned out that one of the eyewitnesses had given evidence, and it hadn't been disclosed to the court, even though there wasn't a trial. There would have been pre-trial. She was a friend of one of the victims of the murder. So Justin went to visit the scene, and he saw from the window that the lady said she was looking from. She couldn't have seen what she said she saw. Anyway, it turns out that Marilyn got a really bad solicitor, lawyer in America. And there is another chapter in the book called You Chose the Wrong Lawyer, and he talks about that as well. So in Marilyn's case, Justin worked with her, and I think after 5 years he got her case overturned from a life sentence. But it took him a further 25 years to get the whole case, to get the court to allow her to withdraw her statement, because she did admit that she did it. So he talks in detail about that. Now, you asked me about this book and why I chose this book. Well, this book, Clodagh, is probably one of the most accessible books that I've ever read about criminal justice. Would you agree?
Absolutely. It is, like, I went into this with a background and knowledge, somewhat understanding of not only the criminal justice system, but also kind of how the law works in the USA. And obviously very different to here, and it varies from state to state over there, but kind of it's very different to here, especially with the prison system is so different. I mean, like you're mentioning, there's private prisons over there, which
Supermax.
It's just incredible to me how that's even allowed. But it is one of the most accessible books because he's such a great speaker. He's really easy to understand. He breaks it down. He really explains what every little facet of everything means and presents it in a way that is so understandable to anyone. Really.
You don't have to have a background in journalism, in crime, because he's a storyteller. Because I think that's what makes this book so interesting to, the non-academic, or to somebody who just has a passing interest, because he tells real life stories and he tells them in great detail. He talks about another one, I can't remember, was it Jennifer and Roland? I think it was another rape case, and they became friends. And I think what happened was Roland, I think his name was convicted of rape of Jennifer. And Jennifer was a student in university over there, and she was unfortunately raped. And when she gave her evidence, hopefully I'm not mixing up a couple of cases, but I think this is the one, she gave her evidence that because she was a high achiever academic, and that she said, I looked him straight in the eye, I'll be able to identify this man. And then the detective who was in charge of the case brought her in and showed her, the way they show 6 photographs. They don't really do it that much now. And I suppose it's the way the criminal justice is done over there, and the language that we use, we have to be very careful when we're presenting potential witnesses with potential evidence. So the line would have been used to Jennifer was, we have a man in custody. Can you tell us, can you see that man here? So cognitively for the witness, what can happen to that person is they have this cognitive bias then, because they believe now they have the man in custody. And so it must be one of these 6 men.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that happened as well in one of the stories was that, there's this witness lineup, and she goes in, and I suppose it's supposed to be, let's say the alleged perpetrator was a tall white man with blonde hair and blue eyes. They're supposed to have 6 tall white men, blonde hair, blue eyes. But this woman went in, and there was one tall man, blonde hair, blue eyes, and the rest looked completely different. And they're supposed to have them look similar so that they're making sure that they're picking out the correct person, right?
Yeah. And actually what's happened in America, like there's been millions paid out to people because of wrongful convictions, because of that same detective. And as far as I understand, he's retired now with his pension. I don't really know what the government are doing over there with him, but he's not the first, and no doubt will be the last. So the book, I mean, I just find Justin's work really interesting, because this is not his only book. He's written other books, and his work is fascinating. Like he's currently working, I'm almost sure, in Mexico, setting up the criminal justice system there, because there's been a whole kind of gangland kind of cull that went on, and I think the mayor, a lady in Mexico, was killed, and there's a whole kind of there's a kind of a flux going on there between the democracy and the criminal justice system. So he's involved in all that. And I think he's involved in Chile as well, I'm almost sure. And he's also a visiting academic. He's in England at the moment, and he visits. His wife is from Liverpool. So just a really, really interesting man, and I would say to anyone, follow him on socials, and follow the Innocence Projects, because he set up the California one, but there's Innocence Projects all over America, and we have one in Ireland as well.
We do have one in Ireland, which we can get back to in a little bit, because I was actually very intrigued to find out that there was one here. It was only something I found out very recently. But let's talk a little bit about wrongful convictions. What exactly are they? And what are the kind of the factors? Like we spoke there a little bit about the eyewitness misidentification. But there's also things like false confessions, unreliable informants, so like jailhouse informants, inadequate defence, which you talked about there. Again, your lawyer not being the right one, not being up for the job. Official misconduct, of course, which is where there's corruption. Coerced pleas, which is where the police can coerce a confession. For example, Brendan Dassey, he's a very famous example of that. Another one is the misapplication of forensic science, which I want to talk about, which is incredibly interesting. It's basically where, a science is misconstrued or misrepresented to the jury as something that's completely infallible.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a really famous one, I'm talking about Netflix a lot now, but there was a really famous one on Netflix called The Staircase, I think.
Yes.
Do you remember that one? I mean, that was really intriguing. And the science that was used in that proved his innocence. But many of us that watched that would kind of scratch our heads and go, how did that happen? I suppose you can kind of get experts to prove anything one way or the other.
Especially in the States, may I add. We see this a lot there. In terms of, you can, like over there, again, they've got the private prisons, but you can also pay an expert to redo an autopsy or give their expert opinion on, certain forensic evidence that may not be like necessarily what, the defence and the prosecution can have theirs. And again, there's money passing hands.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a ton of corruption within any criminal justice system that can be, I suppose, manipulated in that way. And we know, I mean, my background is psychology. Before I specialised in criminology, my background is psychology. So in terms of the cognitive functioning of the brain and the way the memory works, we know that people can be primed and people can be manipulated depending on how they're approached in terms of recalling memory. And there's lots of very famous tests out there that you can look up. There's one, I remember, a long time ago in college, and we were looking at, cognitive dissonance and how we can look at a scene and then we only pick out bits that are relevant to us. And I remember there was this scene and a gorilla passes across.
With the basketball, yes.
Yeah. And lots of us didn't spot it, but, and a lot of people will know about this. So, I think the whole forensic science and like there's been all this really, like over the years, if you look at any criminal justice system, you'll see science that has been debunked. Experts, look at the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp trial. Some of the experts on that, you were listening to some of their, and it was personal opinion. And if the science doesn't back it up robustly, that it cannot be, it has to be empirically, rehearsed and done again and again. If somebody just comes in with a personal opinion, they can't debunk scientific evidence. But do you remember years ago, there was a whole thing, you might not remember, Clodagh, there was a whole thing around regression, and people were being hypnotised to give their evidence.
Yes.
And there was false memories put in, and that was proved that was a manipulation. Because you see, when you talk about the cognition of the brain, you've probably heard of things like cognitive behaviour therapy, which is a rewiring of the brain. And if people are open to interpretation and manipulation, particularly when traumatized, because trauma affects the neurological responses in the brain. And if you're somebody who has been traumatized by a violent crime, for example, and in this book there is talk about different violent crimes that people have experienced, then you might just want your story or your case to be over. So you may be inclined to go along with whatever you're being asked to go along with because you just want to close the chapter. That is a possibility. Yeah. And if forensics will back it up, for example, if they can tell you, we know the fire started in this room because of this, we know the bullet hit you from that angle because it came from up there and this person was witness there, then you can understand why people might be cajoled or coerced into going along with that. And that's not to say that the person has any kind of malpractice in it themselves. They're not purposely, like when you look at Jennifer and Roland in this book, they end up being friends, and they wrote a book about eyewitness testimony, and they campaign around America around eyewitness testimony that it cannot be trusted without other corroborating evidence. So we're only human at the end of the day, and we all have our own biases.
Exactly. And this is actually something you would think, I wouldn't do that. I definitely would get that right. I'm studying criminology at the moment in college, and we were doing, just before our lecture on eyewitness testimony, the lecturer had somebody come into our other lecture, go up to the top of the room, get something and leave, and then asked us in the class, what did that person look like? And we were all dumb. We're like, huh?
Yeah.
So, you think that you might get it correctly, but actually, when you're a witness to something, even again, like you said, we had that example of the monkey walking through the basketball game. Like, you don't actually pick up on everything. And, for example, when people are going in and talking about height and stuff like that, like, describing what the perpetrator would have looked like, or different things, different factors can be at play there. Because I actually witnessed something once, and I said I said no, it was a carjacking actually, and I said no, there was definitely a woman with a blonde ponytail in the back of the car, 100%, that's what I saw. And the guard was like, there was nobody in the back of that car. I was like,
no, there was CCTV to prove there wasn't.
I was like, there definitely was. And they were like, no, we're sorry, there wasn't. So there you go. It's anyone can do it. But that's something as well I want to talk to you about, is one thing that people would say, I'd never do that, is give a false confession. But it happens so easily. And that's not even in terms of coercion, in terms of we see people being fed information by police sometimes in interrogations online. But how does somebody come to give a wrongful confession? Like, why would somebody...
Well, there's a couple of ways. I mean, we've got some very famous examples of that in Irish history. So we've got the Guildford Forum, we've got the Birmingham Six. So anybody who's aware of their history will know that, and during internment in Northern Ireland, there was a lot of this went on. So, and Guantanamo Bay, we would have seen a lot of it there. And Abu Ghraib, I think it was called, was the other place that they sent a lot of the Al-Qaeda after 9/11 and that. So basically what happened, because Philip Zimbardo actually wrote a really interesting book about it called The Lucifer Effect, and it's another book that I would say to people to read. Now, Philip Zimbardo was a very famous psychologist who did the Stanford Prison Experiment. And for people that don't know about the Stanford Prison Experiment, this was an experiment in Stanford University where, I won't go into all the details, but it was local students, and they put some of them in as prisoners and they put some of them in as prison guards. And what they did to each other was astonishing, and the experiment had to be stopped. And Philip Zimbardo actually met his wife. She was one of his research assistants. I think he had a wife and he left her. Anyway, but he's written a book called The Lucifer Effect. And that is about, and it speaks to not the apple being bad, but the barrel being bad. And what that means is, when you create conditions that are so negative, frightening, terrifying, helpless, hopeless, that you can get people into a state of complete hysteria where they will admit to just about anything for it to stop. And you see this in a lot of social experiments, not to this degree, like Big Brother and stuff like that. You get people to do things in Big Brother that they would never do on the outside world. I mean, they would never go and beg for another bottle of beer in the outside world. But when they're in Big Brother, okay, you want me to jump over a thing dressed as a kangaroo? I'll do that for a bottle of beer. Like, because people watching these programs go, what are they at? Why would you do that? But people do, because you're creating an environment. And that speaks to some of the environments that we see in the world right now. When people say, when you look at what's going on in the UK, for example, when you look at what was going on here in the last couple of weeks and going on around the countries, around the different counties in Ireland, why people are responding the way they are, because that's social conditions create environments where, number one, people are in echo chambers. They're being told this is the right thing to do. And within wrongful confessions, that can be what can happen. You're in that interrogation room. You can be told, if you do this, this will all be over. And anyone that's watched any of the films about Guildford 4 or Birmingham 6 will see that in evidence, because it's personified on the screen. You also then have other people who very often are referred to as Walter Mitty types. And these might be people who are looking for attention. I seen a very funny cartoon the other day, and it was a policeman answering the phone, and he was saying, what you need immediate attention, do you? And the woman's going, yes, please. And he goes, you're adorable, you're beautiful, and everybody loves you. So, when people are looking for attention, sometimes they do it in the wrong ways. And we do have a case of this. Was it Dean something? Was it? What was the guy's name? There was a kid. It was the murders up there in Grange Gorman. I think it was Dean something. And his history, he actually had a learning disability.
Dean Lines, yeah.
Dean Lines, yeah. And he had an addiction, God love him. And he admitted to them murders. But very quickly, the guards realised it wasn't him. But I think he was inside on remand for about 3 months. Now, he tragically died shortly after that from, he was a heroin addict. So I'm not saying that anybody who's on drugs will give false confessions, but you have to realise that drugs, particularly ones that cross the brain-blood barrier, like heroin, like meth, like crack, all of them, can create delusions in people as well. So it's quite possible that he really thought that he did that and that he was living in a fantasy world and that kind of thing. So there's lots of reasons for false confessions. Sometimes you also get people confessing to crimes to protect somebody.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that can happen. Maybe there's somebody they're protecting somebody in their family. You see this in drunk driving cases where if there's been an accident and people have got away, they might take credit for driving and stuff like that if it was their partner. There's all sorts of reasons why people do it, but that's why the police and An Garda Síochána in Ireland have to make sure that their investigation is robust. We also see people getting away with stuff because of the procedural application of the law within our court system as well. And that can be very frustrating for people because we know somebody's guilty of something and we know quite a few high profile ones of that. And people have walked away because procedurally things weren't done wrong. And that can be very frustrating for An Garda Síochána as well. So it's a minefield.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's why people like you and I are interested in it, because there's so many nuances to crime.
Oh yeah,
to law.
Nuance, so much context as well that needs to be kind of put around certain situations. Like after reading this book, I have to say I take everything scientific that I see in a case with a pinch of salt. I'm thinking, did they actually see that person? Was that science correct? Especially, I was completely blown away by he detailed the science of arson and crime scene recreation, and that really blew my mind. That people were taking these experts at face value and believing everything they're saying, but you actually sometimes don't know what qualifications they have, what sort of and there's always these incidents where there's coercion, as well, where people are again being fed information by the police. Oh, did you stab her? No, you shot her. Okay, are you sure you didn't stab her? You did, you stabbed her. And again, I've often seen these cases where people confess to things because they think they're being sweet talked into thinking they're going to get to go home. The sooner you tell me what happened, the sooner you can go home. And they're tired and they're kept up all night. And I know that there's obviously different issues. There's, laws in Ireland to protect, in terms of interrogation.
And An Garda Síochána, I have to say, as one of the police forces in the world, is probably one of the most righteous, one of the most straight, because we've been evaluated many times by the European Union. These evaluations happen. And I know that in the past we did have some issues around custody, but a lot of work has been done to make sure that it's safe and it's sound, because Ireland is too small, it really is. And you can't get away with it. Where in America, for example, if you're in the Midwest of America and you're in a little one-horse town and there's like 200 people there, the local sheriff can do mad stuff. Can fit people up for mad things because you've got federal governments over there, so people can kind of interpret the law because it's so vast. People don't realise how vast America is.
It's crazy. This book just really goes to show and again, maybe it's naivety thinking we don't have any of that here and maybe we're just blind to it and being hidden from it. But to see all the stuff that's going on there and what can happen, it's just completely mind-blowing. 64% of clients belonging to the Innocence Project are Black and Latino. They are being disproportionately wrongfully convicted for things. And I think as well, it goes back to the eyewitness testimony. Apparently as well, one of the things he spoke about in the book was the fact that white people have not an inherent bias, but they're unable to accurately identify people of different races. The same with Latino people. Every race.
It's called cultural blindness.
Yes, cultural blindness. That's the phrase. And it's where basically you easier recognize somebody of your own race because that's who you kind of grew up with when you're learning as a small child. If you haven't been exposed to other cultures or the races that you can only kind of really recognise faces of your own.
Yeah, and I have personal experience of this. My stepmother is black. She's from Kenya. And my two little sisters are mixed race. And I would have met a lot of charities, my stepmother. I would have met a lot of charities, relations and friends over the years. And I remember a couple of years ago, one of them, lovely lady Grace, was saying to me, I can never tell yous far apart because my mum and dad had 4 daughters. We look so different. The only thing that's similar about us is we all have filthy laughs. And when we laugh, we all laugh filthy. But I said to Grace, how can you not tell us apart? Adele's blonde, Jenny's brown, Leslie's brown, I'm red. And even that, because they, as Grace said to me, I've got that cultural blindness thing as well.
Yeah.
And so it's not a racist thing. It's just like you say, it's what we're exposed to. And it's interesting actually that you speak to that percentage of plus 60% in America of Latinos, Hispanics and people that are black in prison. So they're over represented within the prison system, and they're also an underrepresented population. So why does that happen? I mean, again, we go back to societal constructs. So when we look at the opportunities that people have as people from the BAM community, so Black, Asian, minority, ethnic people in America or in the UK or indeed in Ireland, and what are the opportunities that are open to them? And I don't know if this bears any relevance, but the other night I was watching the Olympics with my mum, and we were talking about these amazing, phenomenal athletes. My mum said, look at all the runners. Most of them are black. Look at how athletic they are. And aren't they amazing people? And I said, ma'am, wouldn't it be interesting if you could look at that and say, why do so many of them use sport? Because for a lot of them, they're coming from really poor countries. And maybe sport is the only way out of poverty for them. So that's why they apply themselves. Yes, we do see a superiority, but it's not necessarily because of their race or their colour or their ethnic background. Maybe it's because they're the only opportunities that are open to them. And many people would have this argument about America, that you have neighbourhoods that are continually defunded in terms of education, school, employment opportunities. So what you have is you have areas where you've got what's called the social deficit as opposed to social capital. So we don't have to check ourselves when we walk outside of our houses because we're white people. We have white privilege because we're white people. For people who have a background where their skin is something that differentiates them from the community that they work and live in, and there is an inherent bias there, and people need to realise that. And that means that you've got people, in spite and despite all of the hurdles that they have to overcome, they are thriving in communities when given an opportunity. And if they're not given an opportunity, many will find opportunities for themselves. But you do find within the criminal justice system in America, absolutely, people from ethnic backgrounds are overrepresented. And that's not that all people from them backgrounds are born to be criminal. And that's, if you look at it from that fundamental core, people are not born to be criminal. Conditions create criminals, in my view anyway.
Absolutely.
And in my experience.
And even looking at that, the fact that it's 64% of the clients that have been freed or exonerated, those people obviously were falsely imprisoned. They were wrongfully convicted of a crime that they did not commit. And there's also an issue as well, like we go back to Jennifer and Roland, where somebody, if they're making up something or they're trying to throw police off and give a different perpetrator or potential other person who committed the crime, often they will go straight, if they're a white person, they will say they're black or they're Latino or they're a man. If it's if you're a white woman, you might say it's a black man doing it. It's just to throw them off because you're trying to say this is somebody that looks completely different from me. So it wasn't me who did it. It was actually this other person. And it may not even be coming from a racist place if they're blaming it on a black person, but it's just in the sense that they're trying to create this character that looks so different to who they actually are. And that, of course, ends up being part of these statistics because absolutely people were wrongly convicted. So let's talk a little bit about, I suppose, when we look at wrongful convictions, I know you mentioned the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4, and we had a little bit of talk about Dean Lyons there. There's also an Innocence Project in Ireland.
Yeah.
We were just talking about this before we started. We don't really know what the percentage of wrongful convictions are in Ireland. We don't have data on that at all.
No.
Whether it's a case that it's there and it hasn't been publicised or it just hasn't been researched, we don't know. But what about examples of wrongful convictions in Ireland?
Well, we've seen, do you remember the case in Donegal And there was that big scandal, the whistleblower. There was a whole kind of family up there, and they were being accused of all sorts of things like speeding and different things like that. And the family's good name was taken. And we also have a very famous one, the Kerry Babies case. And there's been recent RTE documentaries about that. And that was where a family, I'm almost sure 3 of the people in that family admitted to the crime, and there was 2 babies, and there wasn't 2 babies, and there was, and I think DNA recently. I can't remember the details.
Yeah, there was DNA recently as well. There was a lot of corruption in that. False signs. And everything like that.
Yeah, there was false signs. I mean, at one stage, didn't they say she had 2 babies with 2 different DNA? And oh my goodness. And the poor family at the heart of that. And when I read some of the transcripts from the court case, and it actually speaks to a very old Ireland, and the Ireland that I remember that I grew up in, where it was very patriarchal. At that stage, women had very few rights in terms of, for some women, they couldn't work outside the home, or they had to give up their job if they were married. They couldn't own land, and a lot of them things we still have kind of a hangover them in parts of the country. Thankfully, things have really progressed. But certainly, when I was a young woman around that time, I remember that having a very profound effect on me as a female growing up in Ireland, because it was the most terrifying thing in the world to get pregnant and not be married then. Because you could be, even at that stage, put in a Magdalene laundry, or you could be run out of town. I've seen friends of mine run out of town. Ireland was no place for women then, really. And I think the Kerry case is kind of an emblem of a system that was very wrong. And I know some of the people that were involved in that investigation still stand over what they did. Still stand over, even in the face of evidence and science. Even though we talked earlier about science, if the science is sound and the science is good and it has been replicated and proven, I've no problem with science.
Absolutely.
It's when harebrained scientific ideas are brought into play in order to fit the narrative of the investigation team is where we have a problem. And I think the Kerry Babies case is a very good example of this. And over the years, we've seen a lot of whistleblowers. We've seen Maurice McCabe, and we've seen what happened to him. We've seen women within the army and the police force and that kind of thing coming out and speaking about some of the cases. So we do have corruption, without a doubt. I think I saw a statistic recently. I'm trying to remember what the statistic is. I think it's something like 90 on Garda Síochána are out for different suspensions and different things. So of course we have corruption. We're not lily white. But I think comparatively, in terms of our policing, I think we have a very safe police force. And I certainly know the people that I've worked with over the years, complete and utter safe. I would feel safe that they would be upholding the law, and that their oath to uphold the law is very sound. I think it's very unusual for people to go into An Garda Síochána with nefarious kind of approaches, people that want to go in for the wrong reasons. I think most of the guards that I know, all of the guards that I know, are in there for the right reasons, and that's to uphold the law. I think it's very difficult being a guard right now. It's not an easy place to be. They're dealing with a lot of changing, they're navigating a changing society, they're navigating a different respect, a lack of respect in many ways. So, I think that in Ireland, I think we can be sure that we have, for the most part, a very, very straight and upstanding approach to policing.
And something very interesting you said to me there when it came to wrongful convictions in Ireland, you said everyone that you speak to says that they've been wrongfully convicted.
Yeah, if you go into prison, it's gas. I did some research a number of years ago, so I won't speak to any of the cases in particular, but one of them did the worst kind of crime. So you know what that is. That's ending somebody, isn't it? And while he admitted during the interview that he had done it, he justified why he did it. So in his mind, he wasn't exactly a murderer because he had reason to do it. That's a really interesting kind of, to me, it's not interesting. It's a really odd juxtaposition to have.
And did he believe that he shouldn't be in prison?
Yeah, because he believed, because of what had been done to him, he had the right to do this. it just blows my mind when people justify, and you see people justifying violent acts like, he drove me to it, or she drove me to it, or they just wouldn't leave me alone, so I had to respond. All of these are like low level kind of approaches, but then it escalates as far as, criminal damage, for example. People were seeing people competing with other marginalised groups or marginalised communities, competing with other marginalised communities, and justifying it by saying, but we have nothing, so now we're going to fight with somebody who has even less.
Yeah.
It's that juxtaposition of thought that, to me, I suppose as a criminologist, is what fascinates me. And trying to understand what we can do to kind of mitigate against people being so incensed and so heightened by fear in a lot of cases, and also try and create less of a disparity between rich and poor within our society. Because I think whenever we look to criminalise people, and we do that a lot, what we actually do is we only treat the symptoms of the problem rather than looking at what the actual cause of the problem is. So if we can deal with the problems in the first place, well, then the symptoms are less likely to appear in terms of increases in violent crime. And like research will show you, global research will show you, when you see poverty increasing, you will always see violence increasing.
Yeah.
And they are, so closely, the correlation is so close there. So increase in poverty equals increase in violent crime.
And with your experience as a criminologist and coming from the background of the work you do and the experience and knowledge that you have, going into reading this book, just to go back to the book, how did that make you feel? Were you shocked? Were you saddened? What was...
Yeah, emotions? Actually, I mean, both of them emotions at times. Like, I'm really glad that I'm still shocked, because I've been around a long time, and unfortunately, kind of, I've heard some shocking stories in my life, and it was good to be shocked. I was disturbed by some of it, because I suppose it makes me, it challenges me to, I'm not blindly led by anyone. But like you were saying earlier, I suppose a bit of like what you were saying, what do we believe? Like, I mean, where do we put our faith in people? But I suppose at my heart, my faith and my core is always with people, and hopefully that'll never change, because in the main, in any institutions I've worked in throughout my 30 plus year career, there's always been more good people, very small number of people there with the wrong motivations. So, because a lot of the work I've done is all kind of community spirited and that kind of stuff. Because I'm very much a community criminologist. And I've worked in places like St. Vincent de Paul and Dublin Simon Community and places like that. So I've always seen people with really good, motivations. So when you're reading a book like this, you do kind of read it and go, do you ever really know people? Because you're talking about, like that detective, for example, the one, I'm almost sure he was the one involved in the Jennifer and Roland case. Like, he had hundreds of cases that had to be overturned because he was just setting up false statements, he was implanting false evidence, he was coercing eyewitness testimony, he was bashing false confessions out of people. So, like, you do... But we can't tar everybody with the same brush, because if I did that now, I mean, like, it's like saying every woman with red hair and glasses loses their temper immediately. And I can tell you, I don't, But that kind of stereotyping can happen, and we have to allow ourselves to be able to, I suppose, adjust to new information. So when I was reading this book, I really had to reflect on it and realise that these were isolated cases. And I also had to reflect on the data, which is, America is a huge country with a huge population. What's it, 150 million or 160 million or something like that? Or maybe, I don't know, is it 300 million? I don't know. I know that it's got hundreds of millions of people in America. So when you look statistically at the numbers, probably when you break it down, you're Googling, are you, Clodagh?
Yeah, I am.
What's
333.3 million people
live in America. So when you look at the statistics, the reason why I was saying 150 is I know about half the population vote because about 70 odd million of them vote for Trump, which is astonishing to me. But anyway, so when you've got a population like that, when you crunch the numbers and when you look at the statistics, it is actually only a very small proportion. So it's about looking at things in that way. And you see, what can happen in a lot of ways when you read books like this, or when people expose themselves to new information, is you can see how moral panics happen.
Yeah.
You know? So just because we might have a couple of instances in Ireland of really bad procedures and crooked cops or whatever you want to call them, that does not mean the whole force are the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it does not mean that the whole procedure is wrong. Because that's life, isn't it? Life is not black and white. But when people live in a state of fight or flight, which many people, and I'll go back to my psychology days, and when people live in fight or flight, and when you live in that stage for a long time in your life, you get in a process called stuckness, and you get into a thing called split thinking, where you can only think in black and white, and that is a mechanism that we use to keep ourselves safe. Is this safe or is this unsafe? And lots of general stuff around that, of course. So I can understand why people can focus on stereotypes, or why people can read a book like this and go, that's it, I'm not believing the criminal justice system again. But constructive thinking and creative thinking and abstract thinking are all of the things that we get when we open ourselves up to new information. That's why reading books like this.
No, I definitely agree, because I would be a huge consumer of true crime in terms of documentaries, books, TV shows, podcasts, you name it, I consume it. And I would say that I'm somebody who's very trusting. I take everyone at face value. They are who they are.
Stop.
But I have to say that when I read this book, and again, because when you're obviously seeing these documentaries and podcasts, whatever, normally it's like, here's the narrative, here's the story, person murdered, crime against this person, here's the person convicted, they did it, here's all the science, great. But then you never hear these stories of where it goes wrong. But it has made me skeptical. No, I wouldn't say skeptical.
That's important.
But I would say it's given me this other dynamic layer of critical thinking that I may not have had before. When it comes to believing everything people say, in terms of, whether it's a journalist interpreting all this information and put it in. And I even see it myself when I go to court and I'm court reporting, and I might take up something completely different to another journalist, or somebody who isn't there might write an article about what happened, and it's not what happened at all, because they're misinterpreting completely. And I suppose it's so important to come at not just crime, but everything in the news with a lateral perspective.
Absolutely. And that's what's important actually about getting your information from multiple sources.
Yeah.
And this is, I suppose, what we're seeing, this prevailing kind of insidious, let's call it Facebook narrative, and it's lots of other social media platforms, or X, any of these platforms, where people only consume their information from one source. And it refuse to listen to what they call mainstream media, because they say there's a bias. Without a doubt there's a bias. There's always a bias. And that is why you should consume several different mediums.
Absolutely.
So that you can then build your own opinion based on all the information. So it's always, it's not funny, but it's almost laughable when people say to me, I don't listen to whatever mainstream media. I get my news from this source because they're biased. And I go, you're listening to a biased, because you're not listening to other voices or other interpretations or other information. Information is being left out. People are not getting full stories. So, the whole idea around critical thinking, education is about critical thinking, isn't it? And the more people educate themselves, the better. But that's why algorithms are very dangerous on social media, because if people go down a rabbit hole, and we saw a lot of it during the pandemic.
Yes.
And to be honest with you, some of the conspiracy theories, sometimes I go, maybe they're bloody right. I mean, you do get a bit mind bent. I remember years ago, I watched a film called The Beautiful Mind. It was a very famous film. Russell Crowe was in it. And it was about an academic. I'm almost sure it was a true story. And he was an academic and he had schizophrenia. And it's such a powerful movie. It's about 20 years old maybe. But I remember walking my dog shortly afterwards, and it moved me so much that when I was walking my dog around the park, I thought to myself, am I really here? Do I have a dog? It really made me think. And like, that's the power of education, and that's the power of exposing ourselves to new people, to new information, to new experiences. And I think when we live insular, or when we live in just a small world, whether that's online or whether that's in a small community, and we don't explore, then we lose our ability to be critical about the world, because we do go into split thinking. And that's going back to the regulation of the nervous system, where we feel that we're in fight or flight. And if you're somebody who's living in profound poverty, and you could be living in circumstances that are less than perfect, you can find yourself getting into that stuckness. And I think for many of the people in Justin's book, many of the people who were convicted wrongly, particularly the people, there was a bit about addiction as well, people that were in addiction and that kind of stuff, that kind of experience of their life speaks to them. And then they become victims to a really unfair criminal justice system that in many parts is based on private profit. And when your criminal justice is a system, is a profit-making system, you've got to stand back and look at it from a helicopter view and go, is this really the most appropriate way to administer justice, or is this a way of capitalism prevailing on the poorest and most marginalised? And I think some people, when they read this book, will probably be looking at it in the way that I look at it, that a lot of this is set up for people from marginalised communities to fail in life, because they keep the supermax prisons going and they keep the profit making going.
Absolutely, because I don't think any of the people that are in this book came from a privileged, rich background where they could afford the best lawyer, or they, because that is essentially what you're saying. And Trina, you are obviously a criminologist.
Yeah.
And you have had some incredible insights on this book. I'll tell you, when I finished reading it, I had to stop myself from messaging you with 1,000 comments and questions so we could wait for today. But tell us a bit about your podcast and where people can find you.
Yeah, well,
I'm sure people are going to want to get their hands on you again.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm working on a new podcast series at the moment. So the one that I was working on with Sarah O'Connor, the gorgeous Sarah O'Connor, we did Real Lives Untold, and we actually interviewed Justin Brooks. And because I was such a fan of his, and I'll put you in touch with him, Clodagh, because he's such a wonderful interviewee. I reached out to him, and what a generous man, like. So he did the interview with us, and we talk about this book, but he's written other books. So the podcast, I've done a couple of seasons, 3 seasons. It's called Real Lives Untold, and you'll get it on Acast. But I am working on another one that's going to be slightly different, more documentary style, but I won't reveal what it's called at the minute. I'm working with a brilliant producer, and we're hoping to probably release in January next year, because I do other stuff. I'm currently working with Dublin Business School. I'm programme lead on a master's degree there that I've helped write contemporary criminology, contemporary issues in criminology. So I'm working with them, and I've just finished my first novel, a fictional novel, with a wonderful writer whose name is very similar to Justin's. It's Justin Brown, and Justin Brown is a very famous New Zealander, well-known writer in New Zealand. So we've just collaborated under a pen name, CJ O'Connor, and we've written a novel. And we've got plans to write 5 more. So, which will be a separate series to the first novel. And then I work full time, as you know, with young people.
You're a busy bee.
I am busy. But I'll always make time for stuff like this, because I think it's important that people expose themselves and get access to as much information as they can, particularly about other countries, because I think that's important. Ireland needs to look outward rather than looking inward. Because we can find problems when we look inward, but if we look outward, we might find solutions. So thanks ever so much for inviting me, Clodagh. Always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you so
and
much.
the best of luck with your master's degree.
Thank you.
Good for you.
Thank you, Trina.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.